Welcome to the first lecture in our four-part series discussing topic 1.1, Introducing Psychology. Today's lecture is written and narrated by myself, Chris Gall, with substantial help from the third edition of David Meyer's textbook, Psychology for the AP course. Where we can, throughout the lectures for this course, we will hew closely to what the College Board has specified for purposes of time. But throughout much of the course, we will range broadly in the hopes of building up your knowledge and expertise and thus enabling you to answer a wide range of questions, including those that may not pertain to specific things mentioned in the course outline. As you're listening to this video, you should be taking notes, and it may be useful at various points to pause or rewind and go back to listen to things a second or third time as needed. So our learning target for today is that scholars will recognize how philosophical and physiological perspectives have shaped the development of psychological thought. Our learning target here comes straight from the College Board itself. At the end of the day, this is one of many things that they hope you will be able to do. It is one small part of an overall story with a wide variety of perspectives and branches that go into making the whole that is psychology. It is worth knowing that while this piece is nice because it gives you some framing for what will come later and will help you see how psychology has evolved and changed across time, that it is only a small piece of the puzzle and will not be heavily emphasized on the AP exam. We're going to spend this lecture on the early history of psychology. We'll learn about more modern perspectives and approaches as we go through the course. Those modern perspectives will be far more emphasized than these earlier ones, but the earlier ones make it easier to understand the later ones, how they develop, and what they are hoping to accomplish. So without further ado, let's go. So early psychology is really the realm of philosophy, which is why you'll see that the major contributors that we discuss as part of that are not actually psychologists per se, but instead more generally associated with various aspects of philosophy. Their focus is not on the biology of the mind or even on its function as in how it works, but instead on how we interact with the world around it, or around ourselves and with our physical locations. Before we dig too deeply into these perspectives, however, it would be good if we had a definition of psychology in the modern sense, and then we can begin to see how that definition changes and evolves across time into the science that we know and love. So a good definition of modern psychology is the science of behavior and mental processes. Okay. So there is no science as such involved in these perspectives that we're talking about, right? They're not perspectives for creating experiments or observing their results, and they're not engaged in therapeutic practices trying to make people feel better. Instead, they are engaging in philosophy. Philosophy is, at its heart, about thinking deeply about how and why various things occur. Thus, these folks are thinking about the brain and thoughts and how they work and where they emerge from. The earliest of these debates range around the actual location of thought processes, which colors then how they are thought about. Thus, Plato thinks of thoughts as being more logical and cold. Aristotle sees them as being more related to feelings, for example. René Descartes believes that our bodies influence our minds and vice versa. As you will eventually see, some of these early thought processes are quite similar to modern theories, and indeed form some of the early thinking that grounds those theories. John Locke introduced the idea that infants are blank slates or tabula rasas, and that our mind develops exclusively as a reaction to our outside stimuli, that what we learn and how much is directly related to where we grow up and who we grow up with. By about the mid to late 1800s, psychology as a study really gets its start, however. The first modern psychological lab is created by Wilhelm Wundt, a German professor in Leipzig. He used it to study mental processes by measuring how long it took for people to press a button when they heard a sound and when they were consciously aware of having heard the sound. The difference is about 1/10 of a second. He and his students went on to study the structure of the mind as it was reported by people participating in various introspection sessions. In essence, they exposed people to various stimuli and asked them to explain their thought processes. Thus, they might expose them to something hot and then ask them how hot they thought it was, whether or not it burned, and how badly, for example. The big problem was that this is all subjective. Different people reported different reactions. A modern version of this is when my son and I cook together. He'll go to pull a pot off the stove and say that he can't because it's too hot. He needs a hot pad to help shield his hands from the heat. I'll just reach over and grab the same pot and not think twice about using a hot pad. Our subjective experience of what is hot are different because we have different pain thresholds related to that particular stimulus. We'll get more into this idea later, but you get the basic idea. Structuralism faded as a psychological approach as people began to realize its limitations as a scientific approach. Functionalism, on the other hand, takes its roots in Darwin's theory of evolution. The goal is to figure out the evolutionary adaptive reasons for various functions of the brain. The basics of evolutionary theory, for our purposes at least, is how functions of the brain help us to survive and reproduce over the long term and thus to pass on our genetic material. This also relies, at least to some degree, on the same methods as earlier schools of thought. That is to say that it relied on self-reported experiences and trying to simply think about why things were the way they were. Ultimately, it faded as new perspectives and schools of thought were added to psychology. Those new perspectives included the Freudian theory and behaviorism. Of all the theories of psychology, Freud's have probably penetrated the furthest into modern consciousness and pop culture, and so is probably the one that you were the most familiar with, even if you don't recognize the name, though I certainly hope that you do. In its modern incarnations, we call Freudian thought psychoanalysis. The emphasis is on the role of the unconscious mind in childhood experiences and shaping how you experience the world today. Psychoanalysis is what you think of most times when you think of therapy. Someone sitting on a couch and talking about their childhood and their lives with a therapist who perhaps asks some questions about how things make someone feel. The original Freudian theory focused a lot on things like sexual development. We'll learn about Freud's theories on those in time, and also why modern psychoanalysts don't focus on some of them, or at least they don't focus on them in some of the same ways. Because the unconscious can only be measured indirectly, psychoanalysts tend to rely on how people interpret various things. If you're familiar with Rorschach dots, for example, those are one of the ways that psychoanalysts get at the unconscious mind. Analyzing dreams is another one. We'll cover each of those things in time if you're not familiar with them. The important point here is that the unconscious is measured in how we interpret symbols and in what we see in various patterns. Psychoanalysis is still used today, but it is nowhere near as popular as it was in the early part of the 20th century. If psychoanalysis focuses exclusively on the mind and specifically on the unconscious, then behaviorism is its direct opposite. Behaviorism focuses exclusively on what can be independently observed. Strict behavioralists don't actually care about what you were thinking or why, or only what you were doing and how they can change it. Famous behaviorists include B.F. Skinner, who worked with rats and pigeons. We'll get into his experiments and theories later. John Watson, who worked with people, and we'll learn more about his famous experiments too, with a boy he called Little Albert. And Ivan Pavlov, whose experiments with dogs, food, and bells you're probably familiar with already. Variations on behaviorist experiments can be found throughout pop culture, especially Pavlov's experiments. Modern behaviorists are not as strict about the "we don't care about thought processes" thing as earlier behaviorists, but their focus is still on behavior. You can find their influence in therapeutic approaches like exposure therapy, where people learn to overcome their fears by gradually being exposed to the things that they are afraid of in less threatening forms until they can finally deal with the thing that once petrified them. It's from these early and widely divergent branches that we get that definition we covered earlier in the lecture. Psychology is the study of behavior and mental processes. Ultimately, we'll get into both of those branches and probably in far more depth than you ever thought possible. So, after listening to this lecture, you should understand what some of the early beliefs were around the mind and its role as the seat of thought. You should also know what some of the earliest schools of thought in modern psychology were and understand why they did, or did not, survive through to the modern day, and should have some ideas for how those early schools of thought influenced how the world views psychology today. And finally, you should know that while this information is nice to know because it helps frame our thinking around the development of psychology as a modern social science and as a scientific field, that overall this information is not mission critical in terms of the AP exam. Take a moment and pause the video on this slide. Check yourself to make sure that you understood and took away what you were supposed to. If you did not, please rewind the lecture and re-listen to the parts that you didn't understand. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today, and I look forward to our next meeting. Until that time, be well.